And with that, I want to turn it over to Nathan. He's been a good friend for a long time. Nathan used to fly corporate, and now he's a pilot for Southwest Airlines. So having said all that, take it away, Nathan.
Well, hi. Hey, thanks for having me. Really, if I am the bottom of the barrel, I sure appreciate being in that position. This airplane's been fun. It started back in 1980 with my dad. So it's been a lifetime for me, for real. I think I was about 4 years old when he started building this airplane with a friend of his out in western Kansas, a place called Kensington. They had a farm strip about half-mile long next to a wheat field, and it seemed like a perfect place to fly a little Quickie. So the two of them got started on this airplane. And over a period of about, well, they were working in a non-climate controlled outbuilding. So, decent weather, 2.5 years, they had the airplane with an airworthiness certificate and ready to fly. Gordon was a great guy. They got along real well. They built real well together. My dad didn't really have a lot of tailwheel experience. Gordon was the other builder, my dad's friend, and he was probably a little more versed on a tailwheel airplane. But they weren't very successful. My dad almost immediately broke a propeller and a tail spring. I don't think Gordon ever broke anything. It was probably broken more than it was ready to fly. And my dad was ready to start on a long easy, so he sold his half to Gordon, and Gordon continued to play with it just a little bit. But as far as I could tell, he probably only flew it about 2 times. And then it was put in the back of his farmhouse barn and sat there for 12 years. I remember one time when I was little in the backyard, I was probably kindergarten age, and our house was literally smack dab a mile off of the end of his runway. And as far as I can tell, putting the stories together over the last few decades, he took off and wound up with an anemic climb rate and passed under the power line at the end of his half-mile long runway. And by the time he got another mile down the road over our house, he couldn't have been 50 feet in the air. And that was probably it for him. And that's when he put it back in the back of the shed, and it sat there until I was ready for it. I sent him a letter as a senior in high school and thought I needed something to build time in. I thought I wanted to be, well, I did. I wanted to be, more than anything, a professional pilot. And I knew I needed to build time. I had no money. But what I had was a dad with a hangar, a dad with tools, and a dad who had built an airplane that isn't flying anymore. And I wrote Gordon a letter, and he offered to sell it to me for $2,000, and I bought it. Spent the summer working on it. It wasn't pretty, but I got it flying late that summer. I think I was probably 18 years old. I must have been 18 years old. And it was a little bit rough, but over the course of the next 2 or 3 years, I put about 500 hours on the airplane. I spent almost no money on it. I worked at the line service, pumping gas. And the manager got tired of writing tickets for 1 gallon, 1.2 gallons, 1.5 gallons. So he said, just come on in and put it down as company equipment and fly your airplane and enjoy it. So the only time I bought gas was when I was out on the road somewhere.
Wow.
An annual condition was maybe a new tire. I don't really remember ever truly doing any hard maintenance on the airplane in the early days, but it served me very well. And I flew it actively for a couple of years, 3 years probably. Went off to Emporia State University, and it was one of these airplanes that you could, I always felt I was in tune with it pretty well, and I always felt like I could tell the difference in the performance by a gallon of gas. And there were countless times I'd be on a trip and, it'd warm up and, I'd make my stops at 150 miles instead of 300 miles just because I knew I couldn't carry the gas. This was kind of fun because it got me to open my logbook from the early days. And if there's anything that really stood out was how many records I put in my logbook of dangerous performance and minimal climb rates and how little I cleared the grain elevator or the wheat field or the cornfield at the end of the runway. So it was a great learning airplane. I learned a lot about maintenance, mostly energy management. You know, with only 22 horsepower, it was just, you just waited and waited and waited. But once you got it up to a couple thousand feet, it was a real treat to fly. Took it all over. Within, you know, 500-600 mile range of, you know, multiple fuel stops. But you know, I go up to my grandparents. I actually land on the highway and pull it into their yard. That was a real fun time. But always got an eye of attention and learned a lot. Nearly killed me a few times, but I'm still here and it served its purpose well. It's been sitting, I hate to admit it, but it has been sitting in the back of my hangar. It's been moved between a couple hangars on a trailer. Over the last 5 years, I haven't flown in about 5 years. I overhauled the engine. It's got a Rotax in there now. Originally it was an Onan. The Rotax I put in it in 2008, and I've flown, I don't know, 150 hours with the Rotax probably. Overhauled it, and I just started thinking about an airplane with more utility, and so it just kind of put in the back of the hangar and has been sitting since. I have full intention of getting it airworthy this summer. I actually have insurance on it right now, so it's really just a couple days away, probably a fresh annual, and could be flying. So we'll make that happen in the not too distant future. But I'll grab the phone here and we'll take you for a tour around the airplane. That's what everybody's here to see anyway. Like I said, this airplane started with started with the Onan. It was a 22 horsepower Onan. It had the big wheels. It now has the small wheels. I did have I added the trailer cut after moving it from Western Kansas out to Kansas City area where we were living. I wished I would have come that way, but I was hauling it on a trailer in one piece. I was grossly over the width limit, but I managed to get all the way to Kansas City without really. I broke the tail spring when I moved it on the highway like that. But the following moves, we had the tail cut put in, or we did it, and that served really well. You can get it down the highway very easily with the tail cut done.
So Nathan, so it was sitting on a trailer the way it is, and the tail was sticking into the left lane.
Yeah, I wish I'd looked for the pictures and I couldn't find it. It was, you know, I was 17 years old when I went out to Western Kansas to pick this thing up. And I was, you know, you don't think about all these things. You just kind of go and make it happen. So I had a 16-foot trailer. It had rails on the side. And I remember building a cantilever beam out one side. And the other side was sitting on a tire on one rail. It was just sitting crooked with the tail. I had the engine mount bolted or strapped to the floor, so the tail was up in the air, but I was probably about 4 feet over the limit on both sides. I was at least 12 feet wide, so that would have been 2 feet on each side. So yeah, I was definitely way over. I remember coming up upon a bridge, and there was a tractor trailer coming the opposite direction, and there wasn't room for both of us. So
is that how you broke the tail spring?
Yeah, there were concrete rungs on the bridge rail, and the tail just started kind of snapping between each rung.
Really?
And I had a roll of duct tape, so the rudder came out of its hinges, and the tail spring was broken. It was all hanging there, so I duct taped it together. But to be honest, that was one of the first things I fixed, and it was probably a good thing because I wound up putting a Dragonfly tail spring on there, and I flattened the incidence of the airplane just a little bit when I did that. So that tail spring is extremely durable. It's been through multiple ground loops and hasn't come apart on me. So the multiple ground loops was a joke. I can't see anybody's face to see if they get it, but yeah, no, it was in the early days. It was. I did a lot of ground looping. You know, in the handbook, it calls for the airplane to have an emergency stopping procedure, and you ground loop the airplane. And I used it on several occasions. The brakes were almost nil. They just have the tire scrubber brakes with the lever between your legs. And yeah, you know, I was ambitious. I'd go into runways that were too short for me, and I'd crank it around and come to a skidding halt. So it was pretty exciting. I'm telling you, it's amazing. I didn't break this airplane. I've forgotten all the things I used to do in this thing. And I probably shouldn't say them on the video because my employer might, you know, they might find out about some of this and it could be over for me. But it really was a treat. The inside, it's getting dated, but it's and I scavenged my radios for some other projects, so it's without a transponder now. I pulled the transponder out to use it in another airplane, and so I'll have to buy another one. And then I was making a hard point for a comm radio, and so I wanted a real airplane radio instead of a handheld. With this Rotax, I think it just never transmitted as well as it did when the Onan was on the front of the airplane. So I think I needed something with a little more watts. I don't know if it was just too noisy electrically or what, but I just never, I had to be within, 6-7 miles of the airport for anybody to hear me. So that was what was in progress when I parked this airplane. You can see I mounted, there's plans and there's not plans. And I've had a little of each. I mounted this panel with hard points inside, which the plans, as you all know, it came up with the canopy, and I would definitely have the panel mounted. If I were to do it again, I would mount the panel in the canopy and have it come up with the canopy. It's just way easier to get in and out of the airplane. Not that it's difficult the way it is, but all the avionics are so light. They're solid state. There's few wires. It's just a lot more presentable that way. But I would, anything heavy, I think I would mount, under the thigh on the fuel tank or on the sidewall. There's lots of options there, but definitely with the lightweight flight instruments that we have nowadays, I'd definitely put it back on the canopy lid. The other thing for me, go ahead. Did somebody have a question?
And how do you?
I'm 6'1", and I have plenty of room. I have long legs and a long torso. My head is with the headset on, is probably about an inch, maybe half an inch away from the canopy. I have my cushion. It's not the fancy space age foam. It's really not a very dense foam. So I sink to the bottom on it, but it's your weight is just spread out along the entire portion of your body. So I've been in this airplane 3 hours nonstop, and it's super comfortable. I've never had a leg fall asleep or a pressure point. It's just a super comfortable airplane. I fly a long easy too, and this airplane is more comfortable than a long easy. You got better visibility than a long easy. You sit up in the long easy, you sit down like you're in a bathtub, and the longerons are up higher on your shoulders. And this thing, you're sitting up a lot higher. Your shoulders are coming up, much higher, and maybe it's just that the longerons are closer and it's a narrower fuselage, but the visibility is really a lot better in the Quickie. And the Q2 that I had too, I was always at 6'1", sitting in the pilot seat. My head was always canted, and I was sitting on the floor. I didn't use cushions in that airplane, and this is a great airplane for a tall person. Without any modifications, just as plans. And then the pedals they're pretty far forward. They're mounted all the way up on the firewall. But and then you can see something unique. I think Sam alluded to it when he made the promo for this video or this Zoom meeting, is the pull start. And you can see here that, in fact, that's how I start the airplane. I've had a couple of ropes break, and that's been real frustrating. So I would plumb that differently on a new install. And to be honest, I don't think I'd install a Rotax again. I have a lot of issues with the way the airplane performed with the Rotax. It's I was always flying the engine. I was always flying the engine more than I was flying the airplane. So I was never really happy with it. It's supposed to be 52 horsepower, and I could never use the 52 horsepower. If you remember reading from back in the old days when Hawks and Norm Howell and Jinx McCammon, I think was his name. They're the ones who were really pushed the Rotax through and made it a feasible engine for this airplane. But they talked about the power band being pretty narrow, and I found that out firsthand. In fact, speaking with John Finley, he's flown with the Rotax, the Onan, and the full-size Volkswagen, and he highly recommended I go with the Volkswagen, and I wish I would have. Despite it being slightly heavier, it really, the limitations I have with this power plant would be far outweighed with the heavier Volkswagen. I'll give you an example. When I take off on this airplane, and I'll back up. I've got a ground adjustable propeller. It's a warp drive, and I'm probably as much dissatisfied with the propeller as I am with the engine. But it's ground adjustable, and I've played with it a lot, trying to get this airplane to operate how I wanted it to. I wanted it to be a 150-mile-an-hour airplane, which is, and it should be with 52 horsepower. There's no reason it shouldn't go 150. You know, I cut these propeller tips down to try to make them more efficient. I think this thing gets to about 130 and it just stops. And that's mostly the propeller. But if I increase the pitch on the propeller to go faster, I can't get the engine into the power band to take off. So that's as much pitch as I can carry to get off the ground. And I'm only using about 30 horsepower at takeoff. And it even builds up to that point. So when I go and I'm at the end of the runway and I push the power forward to take this airplane in the air, it's owning magnificent. I mean, it's almost nothing. It just puts along because the engine is so bogged down by the propeller load that I get it to about 50 miles an hour, and then it hits, it starts to get into the power band, and I can get it into the air at about 55, 58 miles an hour. But I have to hold it in ground effect until I get it up to about 85 or 90. So it sounds just like an Evinrude outboard motor. It bogs and it bogs and it bogs. And then finally you get it unloaded enough at about 5 miles an hour, you can start climbing out. And then the problem becomes in the cruise when you got to pull the lever back to keep from overspeeding. You know, I'll turn 6,800 RPMs and you know, I'm at 40% throttle probably. So I'm really only using about 35 horsepower. But you know, with the 35 horsepower and this propeller, I can do 130 miles an hour. So that's respectable. And the way it's set up, I'll climb at 700-800 feet a minute. So that's also respectable. And I felt like, compared to the Onan, I really liked the Onan. I had no problem with it. It was just that the safety margin was so low on the climb rates that I felt like the going to a two-stroke might decrease the safety margin, but having more altitude at the end of the runway seemed like a more prudent solution. So
yeah.
in that regard, it was a good choice. But I do wish I would have gone with the Volkswagen. And someday I may. But you know, the airframe's getting older. It sat outside on the ramp at college when I was in college for 2 years, actually probably about 3 years in the sun, and got beaten down a little bit. You know, when I put this engine on, let me back up. The airplane weighed 294 pounds when it had its original weight and balance done on it, 294 pounds. And I've never said out loud how much it weighs now because I'm ashamed of it. It is grossly overweight. I added a lot of filler, a lot of paint, I added nav lights, a strobe light. I added a heavy cowling, spinner, 8 pounds of lead in the tail wheel, an extra fuel tank behind the seat. You know, there's probably other things, but there's a lot of paint and filler on here that well, put it this way, it's almost as heavy as a Q2 when I'm flying. So it's, when I go fly, I used to do all kinds of stuff. I'd roll it, loop it, do Cubans, all kinds of things with it. And I don't even dare now. I put my limit at 2 Gs with the airplane. So maybe that's overly conservative, but that's what I've done. And it's just very heavy. So trying to think of anything else that I'm sorry.
Can we see the engine?
Of course.
So
there's not a lot of revolutionary activity going on up here. It's pretty much straight off of the old newsletter that Norm Howell and Jinx put together with their Rotax installation drawings.
Now what model?
This is the Rotax 503 dual carb, dual electronic ignition. And I didn't pull the bottom cowl, but it's a tuned exhaust, and I know nothing about engines. I am not an engine expert, and I did not want to mess with the exhaust on this thing. So it just comes out the side, makes an angle, you know, makes a turn down there. And then I've got this giant shroud to cover the thing up. It's a massive muffler. I think those guys back in the 80s, they cut an inch or two out of it. And I think their power band was even more narrow than mine. But it cleaned it up aerodynamically. That's just like, it reminds me of the old Defiant with that Rhino rudder on the front. It's just a massive kind of ugly looking thing. What's that? Okay. You know, the cowling, I built the cowl from scratch, of course. Well, I'll back up. This has the oil injection system, which I think is fabulous. You know, it's a lot better than mixing oil. So I have this tank as big as I could possibly get it in here. I wish I would have made it a little bit smaller because it doesn't allow much room for my throttle cables to pass through here. And then they wouldn't make the 90, so I had to create this bump, and it's still a little bit tight. In fact, that's something I need to fix before I put it back together and go fly again. They rub a little bit up here. There's a little bit of it's just too hard of a turn. So that's kind of a weak spot right now. But I don't know if you can see it back there. I don't have anything to point. I can't get my hand back there either with the camera. But on the back is the oil injector mechanism. So what it does is, if you're unfamiliar, is at about, I don't remember the exact numbers, but it's something in the neighborhood of 60% power. It injects full, the full 51 or 40 to 1 oil mixture into the fuel. Then when you back the power off, it reduces that. And I don't remember, I'd have to look at the specs again, but it reduces the amount of oil that mixes with the fuel. So, which is, it's nice. In power descents, you know, it's still getting unpowered descents, it's still getting a little bit of oil. I've never had any problem about, you know, seizing pistons like everybody was scared of back in the 80s. And I read about, just, But that is something else, you know, like I said, I always fly in the engine more than the airplane. I had to always, it just seems like you're always thinking about way more than four cycle, keeping the engine in the power band and not letting the cylinders shrink. Well, I think I've already lost track. I was talking about, you know, more reasons to not go with the Rotax on a Quickie. These engines are made for high drag airplanes where you can keep the engine loaded. And in a Quickie, it's unloaded anytime you're in a descent. And, you know, the EGTs get a little hot on you and you're watching those. You know, you're always thinking about, is there enough oil in the cylinders when it's unloaded from the oil injection system? So there's always thoughts about, you know, what's really happening inside this engine, and I'm probably overthinking it. But the Rotax or the Onan was bulletproof. I had one or two minor problems with it, but it started on the first or second flip of the prop. It was always reliable. It always just going thump, 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 but it was just grossly underpowered. So if it was a 35 horsepower Onan engine, that's what would be on this airplane. But you know, for me, this has always been a little bit hard starting. I hope that after I overhauled it, it might be a little easier starting. I thought maybe it might be losing compression. But I don't know where it's at because I really haven't been flying it since the overhaul.
That was interesting. And looking at that video reminded me that you sometimes use starting ether as a little.
I did. I've always, and I found that really frustrating because you go and look at videos and you talk to the guys flying the Rotaxes on the ultralight airplanes. They fire right up. And I've never had that experience. I've had two Rotaxes on the front of this airplane, two different engines. And for the life of me, I couldn't get it to fire easily ever. I don't know what the issue was, if it's me and my procedures or what exactly, but I have dual chokes, I have primer, and for the life of me, I couldn't get it to fire up easily. So I just started using ether and give it a little shot, and there it goes. But you know, I'd always check the carb float bowls and make sure they're full of fuel. You know, fuel pumps pumping gas. This is the you know, the engine driven pulse pump. It is a dual ignition, electronic ignition airplane. It's got a voltage regulator, rectifier, and cleans all. I guess that's what that is. I can't remember now exactly, but it cleans up the AC current that it's manufacturing and converts it. And I'd run my radios off of it. I did carry a battery in there for a while, but I pulled the battery out, you know, 5 years ago. I don't plan to use one again. I was hoping maybe I could get away without ADSB by removing the electrical system, but from further reading, it sounds like it's got to be originally certificated without an electrical system. So we'll see about that. But I got a blast tube going to the, here's the blast tube for ram air going to the B box gear drive. And I don't know if that was needed or not, but it seemed like a good idea. It vibrates a lot. It's on these little rubber mounts here. That's pretty standard stuff. Those are medium density mounts. And, you know, this thing chatters a lot when you get the gearbox unloaded at idle, taxing out to the runway. And, you know, they say that's not real good on them, but I don't have enough brakes to add enough power to get it out of that chatter zone. Otherwise I start rolling a little bit too quick for a taxi. Then recently, well, the last time we were getting ready for an annual, my dad, who is the original builder and holds the repairman certificate, didn't like the cracks that were showing up on my paint. And I knew it was the filler was not adhering well to the glass, but it's the same thing on both sides. So I don't know what the situation or why it was like that. I've got that situation on both sides. There were no D-lams. The the urethane foam was not crumbling underneath the skin. So I don't know why it's like that on both sides, but it is, and it's happened. And so a little patchwork. I got the filler done and sanding done. I just need to get the paint gun out and clean that up a little bit. On this side, I assumed it was from a gas and fuel residue, but it's on both sides, so I really don't know. I did have a mid-span elevator hinge break.
Really?
So I just had mentioned here that I was doing a pre-flight, and I noticed that I had a mid-span hinge that was broken. So I had to dig that out one day, and you can see a little patchwork on the paint there. It was a pretty easy repair, of course, but at the time my paint was pretty nice and I hated to do it. I thought maybe I'd be able to get in there and pull it out without getting into the glass on the top side, but my glass was so thin on that section that it just came out with the pivot. But it was a pretty easy repair. Just took the aileron off, took my Dremel tool and plunged it on both sides, being very careful not to get the back of that shear web.
Do you have any idea? You have any idea how much time you had in the air flying with it broken?
Yeah, I fixed it with the Rotax on there, so probably around 600 hours.
It was broken? No. I mean, how long were you flying around with it in a failure mode?
Yeah, I had flown with it in the failure mode. But remember, this airplane is, I'm typically cruising 105 miles an hour, and flutter isn't really a player until you get closer to 150 usually. So, I remember seeing a little bit of up and down motion while I was flying, and that's really what caught my attention to it. Just right now, the weight of the airplane sitting on the main gear, so there's not quite as much. It's loaded right now, but
right.
But I could see this torque tube that's in the leading edge of this elevator. It would just go up and down probably 1/8 of an inch in the middle there. And I remember I could pull the stick back and forward and unload it, and I could control the oscillations of the elevator when it was loaded and unloaded. So I knew something was wrong, and came back and landed. So, but whether it was 1 flight, 2 flights, or 10 flights, I couldn't tell you that. But I remember coming back after post flight and just like I said, just wiggling the elevator there, and it was clearly obvious. So my pre-flights probably were not very good.
Yeah.
But I'm excited about getting this airplane airworthy again. It's probably going to be close to 20 pounds lighter with everything I've taken out. I took, everything I added from when I did the Rotax conversion, I've pretty well taken out, except, the paint and filler. But so I'm kind of excited about that. The other thing that I'm excited to try doing is an electrically controlled propeller. I think I'd be very happy with that. So I got to the point where I didn't want to spend any more money on this airplane, and but I think it might be fun to do. So it might be worth it. I can't think of much else. I got all kinds of stories, but with the airplane specifically, I can't think of much else to add, really.
Okay, well, listen, I'm going to ask everybody. I'm going to open it up for questions, and if you're not muted, I'm going to ask you to unmute if you like, and just open the floor.
What are all the NACA ducts for, Nathan?
Well, okay, so we'll start here on the bottom left cowling. That was just for cabin ventilation. So that's just routed into the cabin. I don't think there's any over here. No. This one here, that's the main engine cooling intake. So that allows air into, it just comes out the top here. And then this is actually a fan that's belt driven that drives it into the shroud around the tops of the cylinders, and it then comes out this side. So it's kind of a reverse cooling. The airflow's got to switch directions 180 degrees, so it's not very efficient. So another thing that, since you brought it up, if I were to do it again, I would manufacture a ram air style, just like a conventional style of cooling that you would see. And I take that fan and that belt off, which is probably about 1.5 horsepower, and just do more conventional cooling. Really not a big project at all. And I think it, other than sitting idle on the ground, I think it'd be very effective. So I know it's been done before on some other airplanes. And then of course that's just for the hot air exit. And then those are the holes for the Bing carburetor air filters. So that's what that all is.
Hey, Nathan.
Yes, sir.
Chris Walderson here from Geraldton. I actually built a 503 Q1 right from scratch. I designed it with the 503 in it. And I noticed on yours, your elevators are down sitting there. And mine was the same thing. I had that big spring load on my elevators to get it to trim out in flight. So have you ever considered putting sparrow strainers on? Because that's what I was always going to do. I never did, but.
Well, the sparrow strainer thing, and I'm not an expert on that stuff anymore. I used to know a lot more than I do now, but the sparrow strainers are more of the LS1 trim mechanism. And I never really considered it. This airplane really did fly hands off. It was I could fly it just with my feet on the rudders and steer it around, or I could move my weight from right to left and move the airplane around enough that I really felt like I never had a need for a sparrow strainer. I have both the aileron reflexor now. I started without it and I flew a long time without it. But this is the aileron reflexor here. And I did leave the spring trim on the elevator. So I still have that. And if I personally were to do it again, and I will, my plan would be to remove the spring here, not the spring, but I would put a hard point here and make that elevator trim fixed, so to speak, and just use the reflexor as the primary trim.
Okay.
Even when I didn't have the reflexor, I just had the old sawtooth blade hacksaw, and I would adjust it that, but it was basically either full up or neutral. So it was 2-position trim. And I don't think I would consider the sparrow strainer just because my airplane flew hands off. So but typically if I'm cruising along, my elevator's sitting about right there.
Nathan, we've got a question here. What electric prop are you thinking of using, and how might it affect your weight and balance?
Gosh, so when I was looking at this, back when I put the Rotax on, that thing was available, and it's not a warp drive. Ivoprop was the name of this company, but that was 10 years ago at least. Well, that's 2008 when I did the research, but the only one out there was the Ivoprop that I knew of. And I remember reading that I don't know if it was a moment of inertia or the weight. I don't recall exactly, but there was a limitation with how much weight you were supposed to put on the front of that gearbox. And I was concerned that would put me close to the edge, not knowing how much radius I could really handle on the propeller. I was just getting concerned about weight on the gearbox, actually. But I don't remember enough of the details, but I'm pretty sure that I would be nowhere near that limit with that Ivoprop in these short blades. So the other thing, I think that Ivoprop you can do in a 2-blade as well, which lighten things up some more. So there's probably more manufacturers out there that do this now. So I'd have to do some more research, but that's definitely the fix to my engine probably the cheapest fix to make this 150-mile-an-hour airplane that still can climb at 1,500 feet a minute. That would definitely be the cheapest fix, but I don't know that that's the wisest fix. I think the wisest fix is probably go to a Volkswagen or another power plant.
Okay. We just got another question here. Have you ever considered a half Volkswagen engine?
Well, you know, from what I remember reading, the guys that did use the half Volkswagen were underwhelmed. You know, they had the big, and I'm referencing a couple articles, just maybe 2 articles that I recall. But you know, the cylinders come out. You've got a big area, a big blister out here to cover those cover the cylinders. And what I remember reading is the theory was that it blankets out the main wing some. Whether that's true or not, I have no firsthand experience. But for the 35 horsepower that half VW gives you, I just didn't feel like it was the answer. Plus, it would have required a lot of machining and tooling that I didn't have access to build one.
Nathan, Chris here again. Do you find you run out of rudder on climb out?
Never.
No.
No.
On mine, my foot was almost right to the end on climb.
Is that right?
Yeah. But I think I had a little bit more performance than you because I could see 5,800 RPM on climb out, and I had my airplane weighed 349 pounds empty, 660 gross, and I had the GSC 2-blade warp drive prop, 2-blade ground adjustable prop on the front, wood, and then I had a 17-pound battery behind the seat, and then I had 5 pounds of ballast. But on climb out, I would almost run right out of rudder. It would climb crooked if I didn't have the. I think it was a right pedal right to the floor.
Well, you're at 5,800. You're probably looking at more like 45 horsepower, and I don't think I'm ever seeing more than 35. Looking at the power chart.
Yeah,
so,
I had the 2.58 gear reduction on the front.
That's what I've tried, the 2.58, and I tried the 2.0. I will say that when I was testing this stuff, I was flying off of a pretty short runway, so I didn't get all that aggressive. I never gave it really a lot of time to. I only had 30. I think that runway was 3,100 feet long, and so I kind of had my limit. If I didn't hit the power band by 2/3 down or whatever, I'd give up. But yeah, it's if I had a 7,000 or 8,000 foot runway, I'd probably experiment a little bit more with trying to tweak it some. I remember coming back from Oshkosh in 08 or 09, and I stopped at an airport just like, I don't remember the name of the airport, 30 miles, 40 miles south of there, and got gas, filled it up, had 11 gallons on with my ox tank, 11 and a half. And I mean to tell you, it was probably as scary as some of the worst Onan takeoffs, because it was just, I was catching corn stalks in my wheel pants for a mile and a half, waiting for this thing to get into the power band. It was a slightly uphill runway, had no wind, and what was probably about 75, 80 degrees. And I'm just waiting. I hung in there because I knew once it got there, it was going to do fine, but it just took forever to get there. So I had that propeller maxed out as much as I could tolerate. But I know there's guys out there that have had a little bit better luck than I have, but that's just my experience.
Yeah. I think on my GSC prop, I think I was at 28 degrees pitch, which is pretty aggressive, but I don't even think there was any more way I could get any more pitch, but it seemed to work out pretty good.
What is yours top speed?
I could see 150. I would cruise at about 130, but that was at 6,500 RPM.
Yeah, see, and I could easily see 7,000, and I'd get nervous about 7,000, so I'd pull the throttle back. But I had a lot of travel left on my throttle at 7,000, so it's mine is not an ideal setup. It definitely needs a little bit more work.
Yeah, but as for the airplane, it's like you say, I used to just think about turning left, it would turn left, or think about going down. It was very, very nice airplane to fly and land, for that matter.
This thing's a piece of cake to land. When I started flying it, like I said, it had the big wheels, and I had a wagon wheel tail wheel, and it was not great. But once I put a rubber tail wheel on, you know, I would go out. If I could hold the tail wheel in the crosswind tax of the runway, I would fly. And I mean, I looked at my logbook, there's some pretty serious winds in there. And I probably shouldn't have been flying, but I was. But then I ground looped a couple times as well. But after I put the smaller wheels back on and lowered the nose and the angle of attack on that canard, I never had any more ground loops, not one. And it was just a solid airplane on the runway.
Yeah, nice.
So, yep.
So, what's this other airplane you're getting ready to fly?
I have a Barracuda, and I just got the registration back in the mail. It was well, if you don't know, here's a Barracuda. There's some other pictures. There's a picture when I was 4 years old. My dad was building the airplane. There's a couple pictures of the original paint scheme, and back in the early days, that's probably back in 1982. And then here's a Barracuda. I got that thing finished up about a couple months back. It was a project from a guy out in California, and he had a little first high-speed taxi accident, and I think unintentionally airborne, and kind of had a little problem coming back to the runway. So, but then it was a 20-year project for him, and after his little incident, he passed away, and so the family put the airplane up for sale. And the last couple of years, I've been working on it over the last year and a half or two. So finally got the airworthiness back, or the registration back from the FAA. That was a little bit of a chore with the scenario that the airplane was under, and then the airworthiness is coming on Tuesday. So hopefully next week I'll be test flying.
All right.
Yeah.
That's all wood, isn't it?
It's all, yeah, the airplane's all wood. It's got an 0540 260 horsepower engine on the front, and retractable gear, constant speed prop. It should be a 200-mile-an-hour airplane. You know, it was designed in 1976, so it's yesteryear's hot rod.
Yeah.
Wood is the original composite.
That's right.
And speaking of hot rods, I see race 3 out there on the ramp. Your dad Jerry's been to several of the Big Muddy Air races, and this is my family's pride and joy. This airplane here, my dad. This is the airplane my dad built when he sold his share of this Quickie, and so it's kind of neat having them in the same hangar. My dad spent 11 years building this thing, and unfortunately, he lost his medical a couple of years ago, and it's taken him a little while, but he's okay with letting me fly it and operate it now. So it's I feel sorry for anybody who has to go through that. It's a tough process. Spend your life around an airplane and then it's taken away from you. Yeah.
So, but it's neat. It's a nice, fast, long, easy. I think we raced it last time, Sam, down in just east of Dallas. What's that race? Do you remember that race, Sam?
Taylor, Texas?
No. Well, regardless.
Yeah.
It was, we turned at 218 miles an hour.
Wow.
On it with an 0320. And then, but I saw as high as 224 on the true airspeed indicator.
Does your dad still have the Balco?
Well, it's a GP4, and
yeah,
the GP4, and yeah, he's still plugging away on it. It is the fuselage is done, the tail feathers are done, the canopy's on, the wing spar is done, the ribs and ailerons and flaps are attached and skinned, and he's working on the fuel tanks. So, 50% done, 100% to go, something like that. So, yep. But so it's a lot of fun coming out to the airport these days. I get to take my kids. They're 3, 5, and 7, 3, 4, and 7. And so they're enjoying some airplanes, and I gave them the curse. So hopefully they don't hate me when they grow up.
Mm.
Yep. Anything else?
Silence.
Silence.
Okay, Nathan. Well, I guess we're going to wrap it up then. Hey, by the way, that is quite an elegant chair for a hangar. I've never seen a chair quite as fancy as that in a hangar.
It's very comfortable. This is where you hang out and you just look at your toy.
That's right. That's right. Well, thanks a lot for doing this, and it was a great show and tell. And I'm looking for anybody who wants to step up for next month. All right, boys. Have a good day.
Okay.
We'll see you later.
See
All
you.
right.
Thanks, guys.
Nathan.
Thanks for letting me bore you so much.
Yeah.
We enjoyed it, buddy.
All right.